Welcome to the first video in this new series of videos I'm going to be doing for A-level philosophy. Before getting started, I wanted to point out that these videos will follow the AQA syllabus. So the reason I'm doing these videos is primarily for myself. Firstly, because I'm doing this distance learning, I don't have any other people that I can talk about the course with or debate with. So doing these videos is a way of me talking about what I've learned to kind of reinforce the learning I've done. But secondly, as a revision tool, I can go back to these videos nearer when I'm doing the exams, and hopefully, as well as the notes, there'll be an additional tool that I can use. But as a bonus, if anyone else finds them useful, then that's brilliant. I mean, it's a bit late for this year's exams, unfortunately, because I believe paper 1 of philosophy has already happened yesterday. But for anyone going forward next year and so forth, if you do find it useful, or in some way even a little bit beneficial, then please let me know. It kind of gives me a bit of motivation to continue doing them. So over the full A-level, the AQA syllabus covers epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, moral philosophy, which is also known as ethics, and metaphysics, which is split into metaphysics of God and metaphysics of mind. Before getting started on this section, I just want to go over the syllabus for the first bit, what is knowledge, section 1.1, which I'm calling. So this section starts with looking at the different kinds of knowledge we can have before looking at the nature of definition and problems with defining knowledge. The philosopher Linda Zagrebski is a prominent figure in this section, and we'll be discussing her arguments in some detail. I'd suggest also reading Zagrebski's 1999 article, What is Knowledge?, for a brief gist of what her arguments are, and this can easily be found online. I found it within a couple of minutes. We'll then look at the tripartite definition of knowledge before looking at the arguments against this definition, including the conditions not being individually necessary and also not being jointly sufficient. This leads us on to Gettier's counterexamples. We'll then finish by looking at responses to Gettier's counterexamples, which includes adding a no false lemma condition, infallibilism, reliabilism, and virtue epistemology. The three different types of knowledge that you need to be aware of for the A-level are ability knowledge, acquaintance knowledge, and propositional knowledge. Ability knowledge, or knowing how, is having a life skill like knowing how to drive or to swim. We know how to do these things, but if we had to write them down exactly and share with other people, like telling them how we know how to swim, we'd find it quite difficult. It's not impossible, but telling someone you know how to swim, it's you just because instinctively know how to do it. Acquaintance knowledge, or knowing of, is knowing of someone or some place or some object. This type of knowledge also doesn't involve facts, it's a personal, subjective knowledge. Propositional knowledge, on the other hand, or knowing that, concerns facts and factual claims about the world. For example, I know the capital of Iceland is Reykjavik. This kind of knowledge differs from the others as it can be written down quite easily, made public, and shared with many people. To start with the nature of definition, the philosopher Linda Zagrebski makes a distinction between the objects of knowledge, which are the objects in the world that I know about, and the components of knowledge, what is needed to know. So knowledge involves a relation between a knower, which is a conscious being, and the object, meaning that knowledge involves a cognitive contact with reality, with people forming a relationship with the world around them, and that is why knowledge is valued. For Zagrebski, ability knowledge has very little value, but acquaintance knowledge and propositional knowledge do, as both stem from this cognitive contact with reality. Knowledge by acquaintance involves a person experiencing something directly. However, propositional knowledge has been the main focus of epistemology, as it can be written down, shared, and understood by many people. So the object of knowledge in propositional knowledge is what can be made public and shared. The belief we have about the object is the subjective component of knowledge. What is believed is a true proposition. So what are the problems with definition? In terms of seeking a definition, Zagrebski considers the different types of definition available. The first kind of definition is a theoretical or conceptual definition. However, this just defines what a term means rather than seeking something more concrete. Zagrebski also dismisses a practical definition which would only define specific instances of knowledge. What Zagrebski argues for is a real definition that captures the real essence of what knowledge is as a concept. The term essence has been used by philosophers throughout time, and a prominent usage here is by John Locke in his essays concerning human understanding. Locke believes some objects have a real essence, which is an underlying cause that makes something the way it is. For example, water has a real essence in its chemical makeup, H2O. You can't have water without H2O. However, Zagzebski is sceptical about whether knowledge has a real essence. She states the term's been used many times by many people over the years and has attracted various connotations to it. So it's become more of a socially constructed concept. However, she believes that to find the real definition of knowledge, we need to treat knowledge as having a real essence. One method for finding a real definition of knowledge is to think about the term in the way of necessary and sufficient conditions. A necessary condition is one which must be present for an event to occur, whereas a sufficient condition is one possible condition that will produce an event. So if we think about knowledge in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, we can look at a definition of knowledge called the tripartite definition, and that has its origins in Plato's Theaetetus. It's kind of ironic, really, because as we discover a bit later on, Plato argues against belief being connected to knowledge in his works The Republic, but for now, in Theaetetus, knowledge was said to be a true belief which was justified. So the three conditions for knowledge in the tripartite definition are justified true belief. There's various sort of ways this is written down in various textbooks, but the one I've written here on screen is you know some proposition P, if and only if the proposition P is true, you believe that P, and your belief that P is justified. So as I said, this is written down in various textbooks. It's, instead of the proposition you believe, it's I know, I believe, and so forth. Someone believes. But the one I've used here is you. I think I change it up a bit later in the slides and use I, but hey. So this aims to provide a complete analysis of propositional knowledge, and this view was held until 1963. But we'll discuss that a bit later on when we come to Gettier. Now, if all three conditions are satisfied, aka if you have a justified true belief, that P, then you know that P. The three conditions taken together are sufficient for knowledge. And likewise, if you know that P, then you fulfill the three conditions and have a justified true belief, that P. Therefore, each condition is individually necessary as well as being jointly sufficient. So we can now claim that knowledge and justified true belief are the same thing. So why justified true belief? Zagzebski describes knowledge as a form of cognitive contact reality, which we've seen just previously. Now, reality is formed of what is true, not what is false. We can only know what is true. Therefore, this is why truth is an essential component of knowledge. It'd be absurd to say that we knew something which was false. Truth is the objective component of knowledge, and your belief must correspond to reality. In terms of belief, we have seen that knowledge is a relation between a person who has knowledge and a proposition which is known. This relationship involves a person taking a proposition to be true and assenting to its belief. So to know P, you must believe P, and this is the subjective component of knowledge. In terms of justification, we can look to Plato and his dialogues in Meno. The first example involves two men who want to go to Larissa. If you've done the Open University A111 Discovering the Arts and Humanities module, I believe this is covered in there because I knew I'd heard of this before. So the first man knows the way. He's been there many times. The second man just has an opinion on how to get there, but both men do get to Larissa. So the first man, we could say he got there because he knew the way, but the second one only gets there because of luck or coincidence. A true belief may happen by coincidence, but knowledge isn't true by coincidence. The second example is about the sculpture of Daedalus. This sculpture is not tied down and therefore may not stay in place long. This is the same as true belief. It's not tethered, so it may be replaced. If a person tells you A and you believe A, and then someone else says that nah, A is not correct and B is in fact correct, you may start to believe B. And you may keep changing your mind until you tether your belief down with evidence, so that your belief is grounded and becomes knowledge. If someone tells you that A is the case and you go and do reliable research to justify this belief, then it's less likely that you're going to replace that with B. If someone says, oh, actually B is the case, you'll be like, well, actually, no, I know A is the case because I've researched it. Therefore, we could say evidence is needed for our beliefs, or they could be irrational or just lucky guesses. So in terms of evaluating the tripartite definition of knowledge, we can raise two objections. The first being, are one or more of the conditions not necessary for knowledge? And the second being, are the three conditions not jointly sufficient for knowledge? So firstly, let's look at whether the conditions are individually necessary and take each condition in turn. The first condition is truth, and as mentioned earlier, it would seem strange to believe something false and say that we know P if P is false. This ties back to Zagzebski's belief that knowledge is a form of cognitive contact with reality. We know what is true, not what's false. But what about people in the past? Can we say that before Copernicus said that the Earth wasn't at the centre of the solar system, that people believed or knew that the Earth was at the centre of the solar system? But if we say no, because it's not true, then what can we really say we do know, as how do we know what's really true? What about if in 100 years' time science progresses even further and we find out that the Earth is actually a cylinder, but our view was obscured from space because of unknown space matter? Therefore, we can say that people could have known facts in the past that we no longer take to be true. This coincides with three different theories, which in my eyes are quite similar and all produce the same kind of result. So in Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, it's stated that science goes through a series of revolutionary phases. Each new phase starts with the collapse of an old phase when new compelling evidence says the old system is false. This is known as a paradigm shift. Here we could say that at any given time, people would know what they believed to be true, and what was true was what the scientific evidence pointed to at the time. To me, this is quite similar to the relativism of truth, and here we can ask whether a fact was true for someone or a group of people that we would no longer consider true. So for example, we could say that people knew that the Earth was flat, or people knew that the Earth was at the centre of the solar system. In the relativism of truth, the truth is relative and therefore so is knowledge. So here we could say that yes, people did know in the past the Earth was flat, however, now it's not. However, some people argue that believing a proposition is not the same as a proposition being true. And if we followed the relativism of truth, then we could say that for anything to be true, all we need to do is believe it. Furthermore, also, how can two claims about the world, i.e. being flat and being a sphere, be true at the same time? Or did the Earth just change shape because our beliefs changed? So the next theory is split into two. We've got the coherence theory of truth and the correspondence theory of truth. In the coherence theory of truth, a belief is true if it is held by a society to be true in which they have justifications for this belief. The concept of truth is bound to the belief system of the time. However, in the correspondence theory of truth, a claim that the Earth was flat does not respond to the facts, so could never have been true and therefore could never have been knowledge. Both of these, however, do still require truth as a necessary condition, but in the coherence theory of truth, truth is relative and therefore present along with knowledge. But in the correspondence theory of truth, truth is not present and neither is knowledge. To me, I would argue that it makes more sense to use the coherence theory of truth, because at the end of the day, what do we really know is true apart from our best guesses? And if we, take nothing to be true, then what do we actually know? So carrying on with our evaluation of the tripartite definition of knowledge, we look to belief. And just like it would be absurd to have a justified belief that is false, it would also be strange to say that something is true, but I don't believe it. I could look out the window, see it's raining, but then say, yeah, I don't believe it's raining. It kind of just doesn't make sense. In 1966, Colin Radford put forward a scenario trying to show that a justified truth could be possible without belief. In his example, a student, Albert, is asked what year Queen Elizabeth I died. Albert doesn't believe he knows the answer, but he still answers 1603, so he's correct. Radford claims that 1. Albert does not believe his answer and he thinks his answer is a guess, but 2. Albert knows the answer and it is not a lucky guess as he's actually learned English history in the class and has never truly forgotten the facts. Therefore, Radford states that knowledge without belief is possible. But here we can defend the tripartite definition of knowledge in two ways. Firstly, we could either say that Albert doesn't know the answer because he doesn't believe what he remembers. It's just a lucky guess. However, for me, a more convincing argument is that Albert does know the answer because belief is present. It's just that Albert is unconfident in his answer and therefore the belief is unconscious or tacit. Another argument against belief comes from Plato's Republic, which I mentioned earlier. So, in Theaetetus, Plato said that a justified true belief was knowledge, and now we have Plato stating that belief and knowledge are two different things because knowledge is infallible, i.e. impossible to be wrong or mistaken, and beliefs can be fallible. but most agree that Plato was wrong to distinguish knowledge and belief in this way, as belief is a component of knowledge, not the same as knowledge. Just like a bun is a component of a burger. It's not the same as a burger, but it's needed to make a delicious burger. In terms of justification, having a true belief without justification goes against what's valuable about knowledge. As we saw in both the Larissa and Daedalus examples, belief can be false or formed in bad ways, and without justification or good reason for believing a proposition, belief alone will not equate to knowledge. Justification is probably seen as the weakest condition of knowledge, and we can question what counts as adequate justification or how much evidence is needed. We will see this when we look at Gettier's counters examples next. So we've just looked at whether the conditions are individually necessary, and from the reasoning that we looked at, we could probably say that yes, they are necessary. Just a quick recap, with truth, it's quite absurd to say that we know something false. It's to do with our cognitive contact with reality, it's the object that we know in the world, and it would be strange to say that actually we know something false. With belief's the subjective component of knowledge, the experience we're having with the object in reality, and once again, quite strange to say that we know something is true, but we don't believe it. And justification, going back to Plato's examples in Meno, without that justification, our evidence for our beliefs, they can be easily changed, they can even be false. So we can say yes, the conditions by themselves are individually necessary. But what about taken together? Are the conditions jointly sufficient to give us a definition of knowledge? So in 1963, Edmund Gettier published his article, Is Justified True Belief Knowledge? This is quite amusing, as the tripartite definition of knowledge stood for years and years and years, and then Gettier comes along and drops this bomb and apparently never publishes any philosophy ever again, leaving behind him a trail of philosophical destruction. The article, only 3 pages long, contained 2 examples which Gettier believes showed that justified true belief can be present but not amount to knowledge. In the first example, known as the coin example or the 10 coins example, Smith and Jones, now Smith and Jones come up a lot, so don't get bored of them. Smith and Jones are waiting to be interviewed for a job. Smith believes that Jones will get the job, as the managers for the job has kind of indicated that this will probably be the case. Smith also believes that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket, as he saw Jones take them out and count them, and he counted along with him. So from this, Smith comes up with the belief that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. However, it's actually Smith who ends up getting the job. Also, unbeknown to Smith, he also has exactly 10 coins in his pocket. So we have a case of justified true belief here. The proposition that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket is true. Smith believes that is true, and Smith has justification for believing his proposition. The manager told him that Jones is likely to get the job, and also Smith saw Jones counting the coins in his pocket. So the belief for condition 3 is justified, and it's inferred deductively from justified beliefs, namely in 1 and 2. 1 and 2 being Smith believes that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket, 2 believe Smith also believes Jones will get the job, and 3, Smith believes the man who will get the job has got 10 coins in his pocket. So, however, we can't say that Smith knew the man who has 10 coins in his pocket would get the job, as this was inferred from a false belief, namely that Jones would get the job. What makes his belief true, that Smith himself has 10 coins in his pocket, has come apart from what justifies his belief, that Jones would get the job. There is no connection between what justifies his belief and his belief being true. It's only luck that his belief is true. Smith was unlucky that his belief about Jones getting the job was wrong, and lucky that he also had 10 coins in his pocket. In this second example, known as the Ford example, Smith has good reason to believe his friend Jones owns a Ford car. Jones has always owned a Ford in the past, and this morning Jones gave Smith a lift to work in a Ford. Smith also knows Brown, but at present he has no idea where Brown is, hasn't seen him for ages. So from this, he forms the following. Either Jones owns a Ford, or Brown is in Barcelona. This is known as a disjunction, putting together 2 unrelated claims to make a final claim. Smith's belief is justified because he has formed it from a justified belief that Jones owns a Ford. However, Jones doesn't currently own a car at all. He sold it last month and is currently using a rental, which means that Smith's belief that Jones owns a Ford is false. But by complete coincidence, Brown is in fact in Barcelona. So the statement either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona is true. Smith believes he has justification, however it's only because Brown is in Barcelona not because Jones owns a Ford. This is a lucky belief based on a false belief that Jones owns a Ford, and shows that justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge. What makes the belief true, Brown being in Barcelona, has come apart from what justifies the belief, Jones owns a Ford. There is no connection between what justifies his belief and his belief being true. Zagzebski argues that these double luck Gettier-style cases, where the justification is unluckily wrong and the belief is luckily true, are inevitable when using JTB, or justified true belief, as a definition for knowledge, and will always leave a gap between the justification and the truth. So we've seen from Gettier's examples that justified true beliefs do not rule out epistemic luck, and therefore cannot count as knowledge. One way we can try and avoid luck or coincidence is to add an extra condition to the tripartite definition of knowledge. The no false lemma condition adds an additional claim to prove the truth of the main claim. So to know P, P must be true, I must believe P, I must also have justification for P, but additionally I must not infer P from anything false. Regarding Gettier's 10 coins example, Smith believes the man who has 10 coins in his pocket will get the job. This is inferred from Smith's belief that Jones will get the job, and this would be regarded as the false lemma, or a false belief, meaning Smith's justification for his main belief is based on a false belief. The same goes for the Ford example, where Smith's main belief that either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona is based on a false belief that Jones owns a Ford. We can therefore say that Gettier's cases rely on false beliefs as justification, and therefore would not count as knowledge when adding a no false lemma condition. But what about this example? So in this example, we have Dr. Jones and patient Smith. Now, Dr. Jones has good evidence that her patient Smith is suffering from virus X in the form of symptoms and lab results. No other known virus produces these results, and Dr. Jones therefore believes Smith has virus X, and this belief is justified. However, the symptoms and lab results are being caused by unknown virus Y, but by chance Smith has just caught virus X, but so recently that at present it's not causing symptoms or showing up in lab results. Dr. Jones's belief that Smith has virus X is now true and justified, but she doesn't know that Smith has virus X, as the evidence she infers her belief from is caused by virus Y. Under the no false lemma condition, we can't say that Dr. Jones justified her belief from anything false, as the symptoms that Smith is experiencing are real and the lab tests are accurate. So Dr. Jones does not infer her justified belief from anything false, yet is still not knowledge. Therefore, while the no false lemma condition copes well with Gettier counterexamples, in other cases, such as Dr. Jones and patient Smith, it's clear that no false beliefs were involved. So we've just seen that by adding a no false lemma condition, that while coping with Gettier cases, doesn't cope with other cases such as Dr. Jones. So our tripartite definition of knowledge with the added no false lemma condition isn't sufficient for knowledge. What can we do? Another thing we can do is to try and strengthen a condition, and that is the aim of infallibilism, to strengthen the justification component so that the justification is strong to the point where certainty is achieved. This makes the definition of knowledge as follows. I can only claim that I know P when P is true, I believe P, and the justification for P guarantees that the belief is true. In Gettier cases, the belief is true by coincidence, and the justification for the beliefs are weak. And because infallibilism requires knowledge to be certain, Gettier cases would not pass the test for infallibilism, and therefore in both the 10 coins case and the Ford case, there would be no instances of knowledge. If Smith had maybe counted the coins in his own pocket, he might have made a different claim about who would get the job. So this is a good time to take a small diversion to talk about René Descartes. Descartes was a 17th century French philosopher, and we'll look at him a bit more in detail in an upcoming video when we look at reason as a source of knowledge. But for now, a short introduction will suffice. In Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes argues that knowledge requires the impossibility of doubt. Descartes' aim in the Meditations is to find an indubitable starting point for knowledge. Now, to do this, Descartes starts by doubting all his beliefs in a suspension of judgment. Beliefs are acquired through senses and are doubted because our senses can sometimes deceive us, some of the time, such as when we hallucinate. And if our senses can deceive us some of the time, then they can deceive us all of the time, or so Descartes thought. Descartes argued that it can be difficult to distinguish between our dream and waking experiences, and that we cannot be sure we're not in a dream state right now. and this calls into question our ability to gain knowledge of the world. Now, to push philosophical skepticism to the limit, Descartes imagines an evil demon is deceiving him constantly. Therefore, we have reason to doubt all our senses and nothing can be certain. This line of thinking means that Descartes ends up with only one certain truth, that he exists, the famous cogito ergo sum statement, or I think, therefore I am. He argues that if the demon is deceiving him, the fact he is deceived means he exists. The fact he has thoughts and is thinking also prove he exists. While he may be deceived about the content of his thoughts, he can't be deceived about the fact he is actually thinking, and that proves he exists. So coming back to infallibilism, if we need knowledge to be 100% certain, then we'd end up with very little knowledge, such as the only thing Descartes being certain of is that he exists. Now this is solipsism, which simply states that the self is all that can be known to exist, and we can't know the external world at all exists, or other minds for that matter, because we can't perceive them. This leads to philosophical skepticism, with the view that knowledge is impossible to attain. Now, Zagzebski notes that Gettier cases are caused when there is a gap between truth and justification. However, infallibilism requires certainty of justification, so it would be impossible for a justified belief to be false. Justification of certainty guarantees truth of belief, so truth and justification don't come apart. So that's a positive for infallibilism. However, what kind of certainty are we looking for? It can't be a feeling of certainty, as this is subjective and we can be certain of something which turns out to be false. Certainty in this respect needs to be something related to infallibilism, in that it must be impossible we're making a mistake. Now, infallibilism, as we said, does deal with the Gettier cases and other cases such as the fake barn county case, which we'll cover next with reliabilism, and it deals with the Dr. Jones example. All of these would not count as knowledge, as they're all open to some form of doubt or alternative explanation. However, the main criticism of infallibilism is it goes against our intuition that we can know many things. Infallibilism states that we have very little knowledge, if any, and that most of the things we claim to know about the world would only be classed as beliefs. Now, most philosophers are reluctant to go down this path. It's pretty radical, and then we end up moving away from the common usage of what we understand knowledge to be. And if we do that, then the concept we're trying to define gets left behind, and we're left with very little to find a definition for, as it would turn out we don't actually know anything. So we've now seen how justification less than certainty leaves a gap between justification and truth, making Gettier cases possible, but infallibilism leads to philosophical skepticism. Reliabilism tries to bridge the gap between truth and justification so that Gettier problems are avoided. It does this by replacing the justification condition instead of trying to strengthen it, and replacing it with a new condition, namely that your belief must be produced by a reliable cognitive process. Therefore, a person can only have knowledge if and only if P is true, they believe that P, and their belief is produced by a reliable cognitive process. But what is a reliable process? A process could be reliable if it has a high chance of success and produces the truth most often. This is not the same as certainty, as some wiggle room is offered here. Now, a major strength of reliabilism is that it allows children and animals to have knowledge, as their beliefs are deemed to be produced by a reliable process. Zagzebski also states that under reliabilism, knowledge is seen as a natural good which is desirable. In terms of Gettier's two examples, reliabilism would seem to deal with those efficiently, as we could say that Smith has not used a reliable process in either case. In the 10 coins example, Smith makes an assumption based on a false belief. There was no real process involved whereby Smith investigated further as to whether the rumour Jones would get the job was actually true. But what about the other cases? So in the case of Barn County, also known as the fake barn case, Henry is driving through the countryside, but he doesn't know he's in Barn County, where there are a lot of fake barns, just facades. But they look like real barns from the road. Now, as he drives, Henry thinks, oh look, there's a barn, oh, another barn. These beliefs are false, as the barns are fake. But just once, Henry thinks, oh, there's a barn, when he is actually looking at the only real barn. So what does this mean for reliabilism? In Barn County, Henry's belief is true when he sees the real barn, and we could say that this belief was formed by a reliable process, which is his perception by vision. However, this would not be knowledge, just pure luck that on this one occasion his belief is true. Under reliabilism, we would have to say that Henry knew he saw a barn, and his belief is both true and reliably inferred, produced by a reliable process. However, in Barn County, the reliable process has produced true belief in circumstances in which the belief still seems to us accidentally true. Henry's perception in this instance is not reliable, as he has got it wrong on previous occasions when he thought the fake barns were real. Henry's inability to distinguish between real and fake barns means that there was no reliable cognitive process happening. In Zagzebski's Dr. Jones scenario, we could also say that Dr. Jones followed a reliable process by diagnosing symptoms as a medical professional and also interpreting lab results which produced a true belief, but not knowledge. Therefore, these examples show that having a reliable cognitive process doesn't guarantee true belief. Another issue is that reliabilism implies that we don't need to know how we know what we know, as long as the ability to make true claims is high. A child may not know how they know something despite using a reliable cognitive process. Therefore, reliabilism doesn't give an adequate account of the relationship between our beliefs and justification. In our example, the initial beliefs are being caused by fairly reliable processes, but the beliefs, whether justified or reliably produced, still turn out to be luckily true. Therefore, reliabilism fares no better than the tripartite definition of knowledge when applied to Gettier-style double luck cases. Now, some philosophers have tried to alter or patch up reliabilism so that knowledge would not be awarded in cases such as Dr. Jones or Barn County. Firstly, by redefining the reliable process, in Barn County we could say that instead of saying observing an object, in this instance a barn, was a reliable process in itself, we could say that Henry was using his vision in a highly deceptive environment, which would not be a reliable process, and therefore Henry would not have had knowledge when he saw the real barn. But a concern here is how general or specific should we be when trying to define a reliable process? And would this give us an infinity amount of reliable and unreliable processes, making the issue of working out whether knowledge was present pretty daunting? Another way to fix reliabilism could be to consider relevant alternatives. With this, we should only count a process as reliable if it can distinguish between the truth and other relevant possibilities. In Barn County, Henry isn't able to distinguish between real and fake barns, so he couldn't know he saw a real barn when he did. Likewise, with Dr. Jones, she hasn't considered the alternative possibility, which is the truth, that the symptoms and results are being caused by an unknown virus. So here, the patching up while working for the cases does seem to convolute the process even more. So we've now seen 3 responses to Gettier's counterexamples, and while they seem to work in some ways, in others they fall apart. Now, we've seen Zagzebski has argued that as long as the additional third condition is independent of truth, then we'll always be able to construct Gettier-style cases that show that the definition of knowledge we have is incorrect. Zagzebski argues for a definition that shows how and why truth and the third condition are connected. In virtue epistemology, we can say that someone knows P if and only if they believe that P, and the belief in P is the result of them exercising their epistemic or intellectual virtues. The first obvious thing here is that the first condition we've seen previously, that P is true, is missing from this definition. This is due to the fact that an act of intellectual virtue is defined as entailing that the belief formed is true, as performing an act of intellectual virtue is to reach the truth. In virtue epistemology, knowledge is seen as a kind of achievement, and therefore instead of analysing knowledge in terms of a process like reliabilism does, virtue epistemology focuses on the person and what they do in forming their beliefs. This resolves the issue we found in reliabilism when trying to define what a reliable process was by concentrating on the kind of skills which are required to know, although using a reliable process could be deemed an act of intellectual virtue. Knowing here requires commitment and dedication to finding the truth and being in the right frame of mind. Virtue epistemology doesn't allow for accidental knowledge either, as to know means to arrive at a belief which is true because of one's intellectual virtues, such as a motivation to learn the truth, thinking clearly, and having skills such as problem solving and critical thinking. If someone is determined and committed to finding the truth, then they should not be so easily fooled into believing something false. Now, Zagzebski is a virtue epistemologist, and she develops her account of intellectual virtue from Aristotle's theory of virtues. A virtue is a state of a person that is good by way of helping that person achieve some good purpose or end goal. Zagzebski believes that an act of virtue is an act based on the correct motivation, such as seeking the truth, This is an act a person chooses because of their character, and it's also a successful act in that it performs its function in uncovering the truth. Therefore, there are two components to Zagzebski's definition of virtue. Firstly, a virtue must motivate us to pursue what's good, like finding the truth, as we care about what's true. Secondly, a virtue involves a component that enables us to be successful and gives us the ability to be reliable on forming true beliefs. Therefore, Zagzebski's definition of knowledge could be said to be a belief arising out of acts of intellectual virtue, with virtues just being defined previously. Now, Zagzebski offers up two scenarios which follow each other. In the first scenario, a judge, through impeccable procedure and motivated by justice, believes that a man is guilty of murder, exhibiting all the virtues appropriate to the situation. But the accused is not actually the murderer. The judge has made a mistake through no defect of his own, and what has happened is simply bad luck. The judge's act is not an act of justice, even though we would praise the judge for acting justly. In the second scenario, to achieve a Gettier-style example, we need to add an element of luck that cancels out the bad luck present in the first scenario. So we can say that the wrongly accused man is switched with another man when it comes to sentencing. However, this man is the murderer, so the judge correctly sentences the right man. Here, one accident cancels out the other, so that the end result is the desired one. Here, we would not praise the judge's act like we would have done if he had found the right man guilty in the first place. So in the first scenario, the judge displays intellectual virtues, but he still gets it wrong, and no truth is discovered. In the second scenario, the judge doesn't appear to display intellectual virtue. He doesn't even realise that a different man is now standing in front of him, and he gets the decision right by coincidence. The judge does not have knowledge in either example. He's praised for his virtues in the first case, but doesn't get the act right, and in the second case, he fails to notice the switching of defendants, therefore lacking intellectual virtue. For Zagzebski, the act must be good in every respect. Quite simply, in these scenarios, scenario 1, the act is virtuous but lacks success, and in scenario 2, the act lacks virtue but is successful. For Zagzebski, some good is lacking in both of these examples. So how well does virtue epistemology stand up to criticism? Regarding Barn County, we would say that Henry lacked knowledge because he lacks intellectual virtues. This is because he's unable to differentiate between real and fake barns, lacking critical awareness, and probably not paying much attention to detail. Virtue epistemology here doesn't just care about his final claim, oh, there's a barn, when he sees the real barn. It also cares about what happened previously. Henry made the same claim about the fake barns he saw, and therefore the success component of virtue epistemology is missing, as most of the time Henry got it wrong. Therefore, under virtue epistemology, Henry lacks knowledge, and this coincides with our general consensus on the matter. But should we really expect Henry to investigate all the barns thoroughly? And because of this lack of investigation, should we say that Henry lacks intellectual virtues in general? Virtue epistemology does stand up well to Gettier-style cases, as it requires belief to be acquired through a process which involves acts of intellectual virtue. We could also say that virtue epistemology stands up well to Dr. Jones' example, as Dr. Jones didn't get it right, and we have room to question if she was intellectually virtuous when she did not investigate alternative reasons for patient Smith's test results and symptoms. But once again, is it reasonable to question whether Dr. Jones should have foreseen an unknown virus instead of the virus which matched the symptoms and test results? From this, we can ask, what are intellectual virtues, and when do we know if we're being virtuous? And if we regard these questions as relevant, then we would indicate that animals and children do not have knowledge, as we earlier said, as children lack the thought process of knowing how they know, and with animals they lack clear motives for their actions. But regarding children, Zagzebski says that we can redefine virtue broadly so that acts of intellectual virtues need not be complex, but could be unconscious, such as the process of remembering. The motivation to find truth also doesn't need to be obvious. It could simply be a child wanting to know what's in their environment. And with this in mind, we could say that under virtue epistemology, young children could have knowledge as soon as they can tell the difference between truth and falsehoods. Virtue epistemology also avoids the gap we've seen with other responses between the truth and the third condition, because the belief must be true and produced by acts of intellectual virtue, and the truth must be the result of such acts. Dr. Jones reached her belief through intellectually virtuous acts, but that didn't lead her to the truth about her patient, once again making the Dr. Jones case correspond with our view that knowledge was not present in this case. But can we say that virtues have a place in defining knowledge? Should we only grant knowledge to people who have intellectual virtues most of the time, or can we award individual instances of intellectual virtue even if this may be out of character for the person concerned. For example, if someone usually believes everything they read online, like most voters of a particular political party, but on one occasion their interest has been piqued, let's say, and they take time to research the matter and look up trustworthy sources, we would generally say that this act was virtuous. But if this action or these actions are not usually in that person's character, could we say they are being virtuous? And finally, should motive matter at all in virtue epistemology? I mean, without motive, can reliable processes find truths? Or can they still be open to coincidental truths unless a person is motivated to find the truth? While in the Barn County case, we could say that Henry probably didn't have a motivation to find the truth, as he's just making observations as he's driving along. In the Dr. Jones case, can we really say Dr. Jones had no motivation to find the truth in a professional capacity as a doctor? Or is the Dr. Jones case settled purely on the fact that Dr. Jones got it wrong in this instance? But at the same time, we could argue that Dr. Jones probably uses the same intellectual virtues on a number of other patients and is probably right a lot of the time. So could this satisfy the success component, even though she got it wrong just this once, like Henry got it wrong all the time bar once? This is purely nitpicking, and on the whole, it does appear that virtue epistemology does answer a lot of the counterexamples thrown at it to provide a fairly solid definition of what knowledge truly is. So that brings us to the end of this video and the first section of epistemology, what is knowledge? If you enjoyed it or found it in any way helpful, then please leave a comment, let me know. I will just reiterate, I am not a teacher, I am a student. I am studying this A-level as a student, so I don't profess to be any kind of expert. These are just my own revision notes in video style. So, you know, if there's some bits that aren't quite 100% right, I do apologise. I'm just going through my notes and making a video on them. So I just want to put that disclaimer there. I'm not a teacher, don't take what I say as gospel. But, you know, these notes have come from reliable sources, textbooks for the A-levels. So anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Bye.